April 1961. The Soviets put the first man in space. Just weeks later, the Americans announced they would be one-upping them by sending a man to the moon.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
It was a bold assertion, particularly as by this time, the US had only ever sent one person into space. To get to the moon, they needed to improve their deep space technology, and fast. And so, Project Gemini was born. Gemini was the key stepping stone to building the technology that would keep men in space long enough to get to the moon. A stepping stone most of us have all but forgotten. This pioneering project was designed to bridge the giant gap between Mercury and Apollo, and it repeatedly pushed brave crews to the very edge of survival, with astronauts nearly boiling alive, riding nuclear warheads into space, and being rescued by some of the earliest cosmic computers. I'm Alex McColgan, and you're watching Astrum Extra. Join me today as we explore the science and technology of Project Gemini, discover its biggest wins and nearest misses, and reveal how these vital missions paved the way for Apollo 11 landing on the moon. On the 12th of April 1961, the US lost the race to put the first man into space when Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, successfully orbited the Earth. Determined not to fall behind again, President John F. Kennedy committed the United States to landing a man on the moon as quickly as they could.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
But the United States Mercury program had only just cracked how to get a man into space, specifically one man in fact, Alan Sheppard, whose mission had only lasted for just over 15 minutes. This was a far cry from conquering space travel. If they wanted to get to the moon, they needed to make progress, and fast. And that's when Project Gemini was born. Its aims were set out from the beginning as a project to master long-duration spaceflight, perfect orbital rendezvous and docking, to test spacewalks, and refine re-entry and landing. But before all that, first they needed to get into space. So let's start with how they actually planned to get up there. The Mercury and Gemini rockets had some similarities. Both were originally missiles, repurposed for spaceflight. Perhaps not the most comforting thought, but their structural differences meant there were new problems for the Gemini mission to solve. The Mercury Atlas rocket was based on the US Air Force's Atlas intercontinental ballistic missile. It was smaller with a pretty flexible structure and used less dense cryogenic or low temperature fuels. The Gemini Titan rocket was derived from another missile, the Titan II. As it needed to support 2 passengers, it was larger, stiffer, and used denser hypergolic fuels, substances that would ignite upon contact with each other. This new, stiff frame, with its long fuel lines and the dense liquids within, created quite the headache for engineers at launch, as they caused mission-ending pogo oscillations. Essentially, as the fuel accelerates, a tiny natural vibration in the metal frame causes the fuel lines to flex slightly. This flex changes the pressure inside the fuel line, forcing a sudden, tiny surge of extra fuel into the engine. The engine burns this extra fuel, creating a sudden spike in thrust, a literal kick forward. That extra kick ripples back up through the rocket structure, causing the fuel lines to flex even harder. This all creates a closed feedback loop. The rocket bounces up and down, which pulses the fuel, which pulses the engine, which bounces the rocket even harder. It's like the rocket becomes a giant pogo stick. But whilst this might sound fun, on early Titan II test flights, bouncing vibrations were recorded that were so violent they would have rendered an astronaut unconscious. This was because the Titan II was originally designed to carry a nuclear warhead rather than people, so the initial engineering tolerances were a bit aggressive. NASA, unsurprisingly, refused to put a human on the Titan II until the pogo levels were reduced to below 0.25 G. So how did they do it? Well, they had two choices. Start from scratch, building a new rocket that was more flexible, with shorter fuel lines that ran on a new propellant, or they could engineer solutions into the Titan. With time being of the essence, they chose option 2. NASA formed a POGO working group of more than 1,000 engineers to come up with a solution. One of the main ways they reduced the vibration was to put a shock absorber into fuel lines, called a surge dampener. These were small cavities filled with trapped, compressible gas, usually helium, inserted directly into the fuel lines. So when a pressure pulse traveled down them, instead of hitting the engine and creating a kick, it hit the gas cavity. The gas then compressed, just like a mechanical spring, absorbing the energy and smoothing the flow into a steady stream. This dampened the vibrations, and astronauts were able to ride the Titan throughout the Gemini program with no adverse effects. And this knowledge fed right into the Apollo program's Saturn V rocket. The Saturn V was a colossus, standing around 3 times taller than the Titan, but it had a completely different fuel and structural makeup. In other words, the engineers had no idea how it would fare on takeoff. So when, during the uncrewed Apollo 6 test, the rocket began to shake, NASA engineers sprang into action. Because of the legacy Gemini data, they already had the mathematical models to easily diagnose POGO and the engineering solutions to install similar suppressors in the Saturn's F1 and J2 engines, preventing the rocket from shaking itself to pieces and allowing astronauts to ride it safely on the next test. But getting off the ground was just the start. Back in the early 1960s, the Gemini and Apollo programs were running concurrently. Gemini was the more active training ground, while Apollo was still on the drawing board. So in 1962, when NASA selected Lunar Orbit Rendezvous as a way for the Apollo mission to land, it needed a command module for travel and a separate lunar module to descend to the lunar surface. But NASA had never even flown 2 craft at the same time, let alone needing to separate and reconnect them in the depths of space. This kickstarted a whole testing phase for the Gemini missions to work out how to do it. At first, engineers were skeptical about the possibility of spacecraft that moved at 28,000 kilometers per hour meeting in space, but it was deemed worth a try. This was one of the main aims of the Gemini program, and the first mission to test the new ideas was an intense pursuit. Gemini 7 served as the passive target, while Gemini 6A was launched to find it. They weren't just looking for a flyby, they needed to achieve station keeping, where 2 spacecraft travel at the exact same velocity and altitude, appearing motionless relative to each other. And this required some deep scientific thought and engineering ingenuity. First, they used the Clohessy-Wiltshire equations to understand and master the paradox of orbit, why you need to slow down to speed up to catch another spacecraft. These formulas revealed that to move forward or speed up, a pilot often had to fire thrusters not towards the other spacecraft, but in reverse. This dropped the craft into a lower orbit with stronger gravity. That accelerated them, allowing them to gain ground before popping back up to a matching orbit at the precise microsecond of intercept. Secondly, they used a digital onboard computer that was linked to a Westinghouse L-band radar. The radar bounced pulses off the target to measure range or distance, and range rate, the closing speed. The computer then translated these raw pings into steering commands, replacing guesswork with calculus, which is usually more accurate. And finally, NASA developed a concentric or coelliptic flight plan. This kept Gemini 6A at a constant altitude below Gemini 7, trailing it like a shadow. By maintaining this steady vertical gap, the radar geometry remained stable and predictable, allowing the crew to transition into the final phase with high precision. And on the 15th of December 1965, this all played out for real. From 435 kilometers away, Gemini 6A's onboard computer crunched the numbers for the long-range intercept. As the gap closed to 80 kilometers, the the hunt became visual. Gemini 6A's onboard astronaut Wally Shearer reported spotting a bright star that wasn't on any chart, which turned out to be the glint of sunlight reflecting off Gemini 7. But there was a long way to go, and it wasn't all smooth sailing. In the final 30 meters, the geometry of orbit shifted too quickly for 1960s processors to track, so Shearer took manual control, peering through an optical sight to nudge his thrusters closer and closer until success. The science stood up, and they weren't just close. At times they were only 30 centimeters apart, staying there for nearly 5 hours and circling the Earth at 28,000 kilometers per hour while remaining perfectly still relative to one another. But the final test was yet to come on the 16th of March 1966 in Gemini 8. They had shown it could find and get close to a target. Now Gemini 8 had to prove they could join it. Harder still, the vehicle it had to dock with was a dumb target, an unmanned robotic stage called the Georgina. So Gemini 8 had to do 100% of the work. Luckily, a hotshot pilot was at the controls. You might even recognize his name, Neil Armstrong. Alongside co-pilot David Scott, who went on to crew 2 Apollo missions himself, Armstrong used the same playbook of orbital and radar principles from the Gemini missions before this, but then also had to add steering the ship into a target docking adapter. As he closed in at a speed of just 1.6 kilometers per hour, he took care to align them just right, as even a glancing blow could potentially send both craft into an uncontrollable spin, forcing them out into space. Inching closer, Armstrong switched to a manual optical sight. He was now balancing 6 degrees of freedom, simultaneously managing thrusters for rotational and linear movement. A few minutes later, Gemini's nose slid into the Georgina's latches. But just minutes after this successful docking, something happened that could have caused the mission to end in tragedy. In the middle of a controlled maneuver, while turning the combined spacecraft 90 degrees, Scott noticed they were also rolling. Armstrong attempted to stop it by firing Gemini's thrusters, but the spin started again and was getting worse. By this time, they were on the opposite side of the planet from Mission Control in Houston and out of touch with the controllers there. Armstrong and Scott were on their own and struggling to regain control. Soon the spin was so great that the pair were finding it hard to even focus on the instrument panels, and there was a very real concern that if the spin continued, the Georgina could start to break apart and even explode. Suspecting the problem was coming from the Georgina, Armstrong undocked, but this only served to exacerbate the problem. Without their combined mass, the Gemini capsule accelerated, reaching a spin of 1 revolution per second. Centrifugal force began to pull blood into the astronauts' heads. They were seconds away from blacking out and dying. The problem was a stuck thruster in the orbital attitude and maneuvering system on the adapter module of the Gemini spacecraft. Armstrong managed to turn off the OAMS and used the Reentry Control System, or RCS, to stop the spin, using 3/4 of its propellant to achieve this. With so little fuel left, Armstrong and Scott had no choice than to immediately return to Earth. Whilst this forced an emergency landing in the Pacific, around 4 hours later, it meant both astronauts kept their lives. Despite this near-death experience, the Gemini 8 crew had done what they set out to do, to prove it was possible to join another craft in orbit. And 5 months later, the Gemini 11 mission perfected the procedure, docking with the Georgina 300 kilometers above Earth, just 94 minutes after launch. This was an incredible achievement, to go from peril to perfection in such a short space of time, and one that would pave the way for the future rendezvous of Apollo 11's lunar module and command and service module. But this wasn't the only aspect of space travel NASA was investigating. they also wanted to master the EVA, or extravehicular activity, more commonly known to you and me as a spacewalk. Scientists had no idea how the human body would stand up to the rigors of space outside a capsule, if at all. Was it even something NASA could prepare their astronauts for? Ground simulations can only go so far when you're practicing walking on the moon. So after years of vacuum chamber tests, NASA decided the only way to truly know if a human could survive the void was to put their theories to the ultimate test. During Gemini 4, only the second crewed mission of the program, astronaut Ed White was tasked with the unthinkable, opening the spacecraft's hatch and stepping out into the vacuum of low Earth orbit. 4 years earlier, the US had barely managed to put a man in space for 15 minutes. Now they wanted to dangle an astronaut outside the safety of his spacecraft with nothing but a thin layer of fabric between him and instant death. While NASA was confident in the new G4C spacesuit it had developed, the technology was brand new, having been finalized just a year before. On the 3rd of June 1965, at 1946 UTC, it was finally put to a real-life test, and the atmosphere and mission control was electric. Though Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Levinov had claimed the first spacewalk crown 3 months earlier, White was about to nearly double his record, remaining outside for a grueling 23 minutes. Initially, it looked effortless. White appeared to be walking on air, proving that his pressurized suit could maintain atmospheric stability while allowing him to move. But that ease was deceptive. To maneuver, White used the handheld maneuvering unit, better known as the zip gun. By firing bursts of pressurized oxygen, White used Newton's third law, each action having an equal and opposite reaction, to propel himself. But this ran out of gas 3 minutes into the spacewalk. Without handholds or a stable platform, he was unable to move around easily, with many of his motions sending him into chaotic, multi-axis tumbles. The real danger, however, began when it was time to get back into the spacecraft and come home. After White used his umbilical to climb back to the craft, a mechanical nightmare unfolded. The spacecraft's hatch wouldn't lock. An internal spring which usually meshed gears together would not compress. If they couldn't seal that hatch, they couldn't repressurize the cabin, meaning both White and Commander James McDivitt would either run out of oxygen or perish during re-entry. McDivitt jammed his fingers into the mechanism, forcing the gears together whilst White manhandled the handle. Inside the bulky, pressurized suits, the physical exertion was monumental. By the time the gears finally clicked into place, both men were drenched in sweat, their heart rates spiking to dangerous levels. NASA officially logged the mission as a triumph, but the near disaster changed everything behind the scenes. The easy spacewalk had revealed a sobering truth. Performing work in zero-G was far more exhausting than anyone had predicted, and the lessons learned on Gemini 4 would set the stage for a much more difficult challenge 5 missions later, Gemini 9A. Gemini 9A was meant to be a leap forward in extravehicular activity, with astronaut Gene Cernan tasked to test the Astronaut Maneuvering Unit, a futuristic rocket pack. However, the mission was plagued with catastrophic failures. To protect against the AMU's hot thrusters, Cernan's spacesuit was additionally outfitted with metal trousers made of Crummel R, basically like woven steel. But once he exited the hatch, the vacuum of space turned the metal trousers into a rigid shell. Cernan later described the experience as having all the flexibility of a rusty suit of armor. The struggle was immediate. Without adequate handholds or footholds, every attempt to move triggered an opposite reaction, causing Cernan to spin uncontrollably. The Gemini suit relied solely on circulating oxygen for cooling, which proved insufficient for the sheer physical exertion needed to get anywhere. It turns out they hadn't completely learnt their lesson in the previous mission. Cernan's heart rate hit 180 beats per minute. He began sweating so profusely that his visor fogged over completely. To see, he had to rub the tip of his nose against the glass to clear a tiny patch. Recognizing the danger, Commander Tom Stafford aborted the test. Near blind, Cernan guided himself back to the hatch by touch alone. Re-entering the cockpit was a nightmare of excruciating pain. The suit was so stiff that Stafford had to help physically manhandle Cernan back into his seat so they could force the hatch shut. After being out for 2 hours, they closed the door and repressurized. When Cernan popped open his visor, he looked as red as a boiled lobster and had lost nearly 6 kilograms of water weight. Stafford was reportedly so concerned that he took the water gun for drinking and rehydrated food packages and squirted him in the face to cool him down, risking the loose water shorting out electronics. This extremely near miss led to 2 massive fixes for Apollo that continue to this day. The first was underwater training. NASA realized zero-G aircraft flights, or 30-second bursts, weren't enough to educate the astronauts, so they moved EVA training to natural buoyancy tanks. Spacesuits and vehicles are submerged so they hover in the water with their weight balanced by the buoyancy of the fluid, so astronauts can simulate long-term labor. This training enabled Buzz Aldrin to successfully complete his spacewalk on the Gemini 12 mission, another name you likely recognize. Secondly, engineers realized gas cooling within a spacesuit was not good enough for working astronauts. They developed the liquid cooling garment, the water-cooled Long Johns, that allowed Apollo astronauts to spend as much as 8 hours on the lunar surface without overheating, a far cry from Gemini's initial 23 minutes. But it wasn't just time outside the spacecraft NASA were worried about on a moon mission. Getting there would take 8 to 12 days. And before Gemini, no one knew if the human body or a spacecraft's power systems could even last that long. Before the Gemini program, NASA relied almost exclusively on silver-zinc batteries. These were the workhorses of the Mercury program, chosen because they offered the highest energy density of any battery technology available at the time. But to power a command module for 2 weeks using only batteries on a mission to the moon, the weight of the silver-zinc cells would have added thousands of kilograms to the spacecraft, requiring a much larger and likely non-existent rocket to lift it. In other words, it was impossible. So their solution was the fuel cell. Unlike a battery, which stores energy, a fuel cell is essentially a miniature chemical plant. It has liquid hydrogen on one side and liquid oxygen on the other. These are separated by a proton exchange membrane, essentially a polymer sheet. This causes an electrochemical reaction that generates electricity. As the primary byproduct of this reaction was pure water, it allowed astronauts to essentially drink their fuel exhaust, solving their weight problem of power and water with a single elegant system. But the debut of this system didn't go well. On day 1 of the Gemini 5 mission, an oxygen tank heater failed, pressure plummeted, and the fuel cells began to lose power. The crew had to turn off all non-essential equipment and terminated their rendezvous exercise. Thankfully, the oxygen pressure eventually stabilized at a low 71 psi, which meant they still had the minimum power required for a drifting flight. Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad spent nearly 8 days drifting in a cold, dark capsule, essentially acting as test subjects for a long-duration survival in a damaged ship. This lesson in power conservation and so-called trickle mode operation would, years later, become the blueprint for saving the lives of the Apollo 13 crew when their oxygen tanks exploded and vented into space just 2 days into their mission. With the technical aspects sorted, NASA also needed to ascertain the impact of long-term spaceflight on the human body and mind. So just over 3 months later, on the Gemini 7 mission, Frank Borman and Jim Lovell were tasked with spending 14 days inside a cockpit the size of the front seat of a Volkswagen Beetle. Scientists feared the human body might break down in microgravity, with astronauts' bones becoming so brittle and porous that re-entry forces would cause them to shatter. And in a way, they were right. The results were startling. Without the load of gravity, bones did begin shedding calcium at an alarming rate as astronauts peed out their bones, but thankfully not enough for them to break on re-entry. This discovery gave the clinical proof that led to the first space-based exercise protocols and load-bearing restraints. Because of the bone and muscle loss seen on Gemini 7, Apollo was designed with the much more robust physical requirements. The in-flight exercise program became a daily scheduled task, a regimen of running in place, isometric holds, and resistance training on their exogeny. This mission also refined space food technology. After the sandwich incident of Gemini 3, where John Young snuck a contraband corned beef sandwich, unleashing floating crumbs that could have posed a serious short-circuit risk to the electronics, NASA invented a gelatin coating for bite-sized food cubes, literally sealing the food to prevent disaster. So subsequent missions tested these snacks alongside rehydratable meals, eating bacon squares, cinnamon bread cubes, strawberry cereal cubes, peanut cubes, chicken sandwich cubes, coconut cubes, and brownie cubes. Whilst they do sound tasty, I'm not sure I'd like to try them. The limited food choices were just the tip of the iceberg when it came to the less pleasant conditions the Gemini 7 astronauts had to endure. By day 10, the trapped body odor and stowed waste inside the cramped, unwashed capsule were overwhelming. The crew even engaged in a suit war with mission control. Doctors insisted at least one of them stay suited for safety at all times, but the stiff, hot suits were causing unbearable misery. Borman and Lovell eventually reached a mutiny level of frustration, finally winning the right to remove them. It was a psychological victory where crew comfort wasn't a luxury, but a safety requirement. This ultimately led to the Apollo astronauts spending the majority of their trips in much comfier attire, flight coveralls or undergarments, instead saving their bulky suits for the more technical and dangerous aspects of the mission, where, should anything go wrong, there were more deadly consequences. This was the launch, spacewalks, any other technical procedures, and then, finally, re-entry. Getting astronauts back to Earth safely is easier said than done. While Mercury capsules were largely passive during re-entry, Gemini introduced the first onboard digital computer, the IBM-built Gemini Guidance Computer, and an inertial measurement unit to help control descent. These tools allowed astronauts to actively steer the spacecraft during its landing. By rolling the capsule to shift its center of lift, a technique called lifting re-entry, crews could actually consistently aim towards a specific target, landing rather than just falling. They were then puzzled when Gemini 3 missed its landing target by 111 kilometers. Eventually, they realized that the capsule didn't generate as much lift in the atmosphere as their mathematical models expected, so they rebuilt the aerodynamic profiles in the computer, and by the end of the Gemini program, Buzz Aldrin and Jim Lovell flew a fully automatic re-entry, splashing down just 4.8 kilometers from their recovery ship in Gemini 12. This precision was non-negotiable for Apollo. Without the ability to steer through the atmosphere and the navigation math perfected during Gemini's rendezvous maneuvers, NASA could never have guaranteed a safe return from the moon or a reliable pickup in the vast Pacific Ocean. In total, the Gemini program may have only lasted 20 months, but in that time it carried out 10 missions, taking 16 astronauts beyond the realms of our planet, and in doing so, it changed the face of human space travel forever. Where Mercury had proven humans could exist in space, it was Gemini that allowed us to stay there, turning pipe dreams into a reality and paving the way for the lunar landings. Apollo may today take all the glory, but I hope you now agree that it was Gemini that laid the groundwork to not only get us to the moon, but home again safely. And these are all learnings that are still very much in use today as we strive to get back to the lunar surface with the Artemis program, and then perhaps even look beyond to Mars. As we do so, we'll be using the same fundamental physics and hard-won lessons first mastered by the pioneers of Gemini.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
You may have noticed this video didn't have any sponsors, and that's because it was brought to you by our astronauts on Patreon. Consider joining our Patreon to keep these videos thriving even when they're sponsor free. It's the reason we can research deep into the topics we love without cutting corners or chasing clicks. Every new astronaut allows us to explore bigger ideas and make every upload even better than the last. So if you've ever thought about being a bigger part of this channel, join the crew to power Astrum and keep space curiosity alive.